Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Air and Space Power Association session. I can't remember the last one we had. It was a while ago now, and obviously we've had the Air Power conference since then. So welcome. I think we've got a good turnout tonight, and we've definitely got something a little bit different for you today. James Clare is going to talk about climate change and sustainability, which, as we all know, is pretty high in the agenda of most of us these days. We know that the chief has had some quite demanding targets that he's decided to attain. So we've got a really good session, I think, here lined up that's going to take us into a slightly different area than perhaps we end up in other sessions. So I'm really looking forward to it. James has got a strong pedigree in the MOD and comes at this very much understanding the mechanics of not just the MOD, but also Air Command and the Air Force. He was PS to CAS way back in 2011 to 2014. I remember it well. EO to COSCAP after that. And then he's done a number of jobs in the MOD, including multiple program heads. He's been seconded to the Cabinet Office. And his current role as Director of Climate Change and Sustainability after his role in FinMil CAP. So James, if anybody, can really unpick this for us and put it in its real context. He is not a left-wing woke hippie. Well, he might be, but I don't think he is. But no, James is definitely coming at this with a really strong pedigree of knowledge of how the mod works and therefore how this works practically within the defence sphere, if you will. So James, without further ado, we're really looking forward to hearing from you. Just for everyone's normal rules apply, James will be on the record for his opening pitch, which will be about 20 minutes. But then it would very much Chatham House rules on the Q&A after that, where we will go to the full hour to 8 o'clock. Please, please, please respect James's position as a civil servant. Not here. So it's about policies, work, what the current framework is, and James is very much here to talk about that. But just shy away. I won't let them through to him anyway, but shy away from anything too political. It's not James's place to answer, nor is it best to ask. So James, without further ado, look forward to it.
Cool, thank you, Greg. Could I just have a mic check because my Zoom call started to fail just as you did a handover? Great. So, hello everybody. I think I know a few people from the call from old, but I'm James Clare. I'm the Director of Climate Change and Sustainability, and as of a couple of months ago as well, Director of Levelling Up in the Union, showing that if you don't move quickly in defence, you get additional responsibilities. So, I'm here to talk about climate change and sustainability, but up front, I'm going to probably make this more around net zero and use it as a way to talk about just what are we thinking in terms of net zero mitigation linking to climate change, trying to then broaden it out there to talk about some other climate considerations such as climate security, and I'm more than willing to have conversations at the end in terms of how do you enhance sustainability and think about value in the MOD in a little bit more of a comprehensive way than just to focus on value for money. I've got a couple of slides to aid the conversation. I hope to speak for about 15 to 20 minutes. And then Greg was saying, take questions afterwards. So hopefully this is going to work. Bearing in mind that I haven't used Zoom that much. Can I just double check you can see my slides? Because somebody just say yes, because all of a sudden all the videos are closed.
Yeah, it's all good, James. Thanks.
Well, thanks. So, right. So before I dive into just a little bit of the taxonomy, I'll give you a little bit of a history in terms of how I've ended up in the post that I've ended up. Greg talked about my career. But in terms of climate change and sustainability and how I became involved, I was working in FinMil CAP, working for Rich. I was the head, deputy director of FinMil CAP infrastructure. As part of FinMil CAP infrastructure, I had responsibility for the departmental sustainability portfolio. And at that time, I probably had half of the C1 looking at sustainability, looking at climate adaptation. And that was essentially the one person in head office who was looking at sustainability. The NAO were about to perform a Environmental Affairs Committee overview on us, and we knew essentially what it was going to say. It was going to observe about leadership, it was going to observe about governance, it was going to observe about direction. So we knew we actually had to do some in-depth review of our actual department. So quite a few of you will remember Richard Nugent, Lieutenant General Richard Nugent, who was asked by Stephen Lovegrove to conduct a review on climate change and sustainability across the department. This review culminated in December 2020. That review was then turned into our climate change and sustainability strategic approach, which was published in March 21. As part of that work, it was agreed for a directorate to take forward this work to prepare the department for climate change, not to green the department, but to think around resilience, to think about operational advantage, and to really get the department's processes working the way they should, because we should already be doing this. Current CDS, last time we spoke about it, just kept on saying, I need to see this normalized. I don't understand why it isn't normalized. We need to be mainstreaming this. The then VCDS were talking about marbling it throughout the department. This is essentially, yes, there are delivery issues that we need to do. We need to adapt our force structure, but it's very much of a op model issue as well, and to make our processes and policies work and consider climate. And so considering climate, so we all know about the physical risks of climate change. There's acute and chronic risks. Acute are those floods that we saw in Germany, for instance. The chronic are the rising sea level rises. There are many vulnerable nations, the Indo-Pac area, for instance, Indonesia, for one. Sea level rises and the indirect consequences of it, such as the salting of the littoral areas where quite a lot of the agriculture is going to cause migration. And there's a whole raft of cascade risks that come from that, which will impact the security environment. And I'll talk a little bit about climate security later on. There's transition risks as well associated to climate change. These are essentially mitigation and adaptation risks. These are the risks that are going to occur to defence in terms of essentially the world is changing around defence. How are we going to change with it to prevent us from having stranded assets? Assets that we can't afford to operate, or essentially assets that we can't operate due to some of those physical conditions. And key within all of this is not just about defence. It's about the whole force, and it's about our defence supplies as well, because there are going to be industrial transitions that happen in order to become a net zero or low carbon economy. And those industrial transitions are indeed going to put pressure on us in terms of the goods and services that we can procure from the defence sector. And there's also a whole raft of other stuff about deployment and retention, about whether we're going to be able to have the support solutions in place to actually go away and support our capabilities in the future. And hidden behind all those photos on the right-hand side and the double Clive Elliots is other risks to government, which are policy coordination, essentially accountability and value for money. And the value for money one's important as well, because it's the impact of inaction. So essentially saying we need to act now. So this is essentially the NAO's approach to TCFD. So TCFD is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. It's being pushed by Mark Carney. It is going to change the international financial reporting standards. We will be asked to report on carbon. We will be asked to be more transparent about our carbon emissions, be it direct or wider. So we know we need to be addressing this, and we know we need to be showing how we are addressing the risks that are on the screen. But I'm going to try to bring it to life a little bit more for you. So I started to mention some of the industrial pathways. This is essentially showing the delta in terms of policies. The policies are the big blue fan at the top, which is essentially saying these are the policies that we have in place now and what they're essentially doing to address our emissions. The emissions are on the left-hand side there. Essentially, the 1.5 degree world, we all knew about COP26, keeping 1.5 degrees in reach, sees a dramatic reduction in our emissions, which is that dashed green line there. The lines above essentially show, and if I can just remove that, can show different emission reduction trajectories to hit different scenarios in terms of temperature warming. You may have heard the fears about a 2 degree and a 4 degree world. These are real world issues or predictions of what the world will be like in 2100. And I can assure you, having looked at some of the scenarios that are behind that, we definitely don't want a 2-degree world, and we definitely didn't want a 1.5-degree world. But for us in defence, we should be planning for a 1.5-degree world. We should be planning for what that means in terms of the physical environment that we're operating in, what that does to the threat picture, and we should be treating other scenarios in terms of the 2- and 4-degree world as risks that we are also planning and stress testing our procurements and our strategies against. So again, just a little bit of a simplification. Mention climate security. Climate security is the indirect and direct consequences of climate change. It is an umbrella term that sits across energy security, food security, human security, environmental security, nature ecosystems, and wraps that all together and shows how climate change amplifies those risks and interplays within there. I mentioned physical hazards. There's a question about force structure changes. We need to be aware that we may be called upon to do more disaster relief operations. There may be more MACA requests. And I know our allies and partners, Canada, for instance, their recent hurricane, they are predicting that they will be doing an awful lot more in terms of their own MACA requests, as well as the fact that they deal with wildfires on a growing basis that also impacts on their ability to train, because it normally happens in their training areas as well. And I've mentioned the wider transitional risks. This just hopefully brings home that the risks are larger than just the physical risks. We've got risks in our capabilities, we've got the structural damage to our equipment and infrastructure. The US come from this from very much of an infrastructure lens and needing to adapt infrastructure. There was a hailstorm, I think, a couple of years ago that damaged not only their platforms, but also their hangars, and they realized that they potentially needed to make sure that their estate was much more resilient. Questions about our personnel, not just about heat, it's about humidity. How are we going to recuperate in that higher temperature world? I've mentioned equipment. Legislation is going to be a key thing. In the US, they talk about environmental justice. In the UK, we talk about judicial reviews. We've had judicial reviews already. The additional runway at Heathrow, for instance, had a judicial review that was upheld because it hadn't considered net zero. We know the net zero strategy itself has had a judicial review put in because it is not giving the policy positions to take it from carbon budget 6 to essentially net zero. We know there's legislation coming and we know there's regulation coming, and that will actually have a price increase as well. You can see costs and funding, mentioned the security threat, talked about supply chain. And also there's the softer side as well, which is on the recruitment and retention, and also the ability to skill people up. And I know there's already some questions coming in about skills and what it means on the softer behavioral side as well. So I mentioned the strategic approach up front, had 3 ambitions. Defence has adapted to be able to fight and win in ever more hostile and unforgiving physical environments. Defence has reduced its emissions and increased its sustainability, and is contributing to the achievement of net zero emissions by 2050. I'm just going to underscore, and is contributing to the achievement of net zero 2050. That is not to say that we as a department will be net zero in 2050. We know that we have a job. If the world is getting more insecure, then we will probably be called on more. And we cannot be seen to be impacting our capabilities. Key principle at the bottom is we must preserve or enhance our operational operational advantage and maintain our capability levels, because we know we have a job to do essentially. And the last one is Defence acts and is recognised as a global leader in response to the threats of climate change. Interestingly, the strategic approach was the first of our allies and partners documents to talk about climate change. It was highlighted by the US Defense Secretary as a waypoint document that set the bar for other armed forces to follow. And they have followed. In the last week, the US Air Force and US Army have released their own climate plans. The French, about 6-7 months ago, released their own climate strategy. The Australians at the moment are looking at releasing their own climate work. New Zealanders already have done. NATO has done. NATO recognises it in terms of the Strat Concepts document and is doing internal work. And of course, NATO Sec General is actually driving this. So there's an awful lot of work going on. But that's because quite a lot of this chimes, I think, with a narrative within defence about resilience and adaptation. That's our bread and butter. We adapt to the threat. So we know we have to be doing something. We just need to potentially take a longer term time horizon to make sure that we are doing the right thing. I've been in post now substantively for 6 months, and prior to the 6 months, I lie, it's probably about closer to 12 now. But the team has only really stood up over the last 6 months. I describe my role as a bit transformation director, a bit strategy director, a bit disruptor, a bit agitator, because I'm meant to be driving the change and coordinating and offering guidance. I'm not meant to be delivering activity. I don't have the money. I work in a delegated model. I should, though, however, focus on policies and processes and making changes to those policies and processes to ensure that the frontline commands and enabling organizations are able to deliver in the future. And I also have to work with the functions. The functions are important. The functions are growing in importance in defense. They're the ones who own the standards. They need to know why they're changing it, and I need to codify it as well, so that people don't realize that their decisions are aligned with this agenda, because it has been mainstreamed. The strategic approach is around 3 epochs. First epoch is the next 4 years. Epoch 2, 26 to 35. Epoch 3, 36 to 2050. The key thing about Epoch 1 is it is about setting the foundations. It's about making sure those policy and process changes have been made. It's about the 1 to 2 degree turn of the MOD to start the ball rolling, to allow us then to start to deliver proper activity from 26 onwards. Richard Nugent was really keen to underscore that this is a long-term game, but we need to start now, and we need to get our approach right from the start. We delivered an initial action plan. The strategic approach had 38 actions. Many of those actions have already been delivered, 35. The then MINDP has laid a statement in the House as a written ministerial to talk about where we were on climate change and sustainability. And many of you might have heard his speech at Farnborough on the same subject. Key, though, and the challenge from the service chief, CDS, vice chief, second perm sec, is the fact that, well, was that the right level of engagement, ambition for the initial action plan? Do we need to set the bar higher? Do we need to drive this? And the answer is probably yes. But again, it comes back to, you have to start somewhere. You have to get the principles in place to start off with. You have to have the right data. You have to have capacity. You have to have understanding. And you have to build from there to go away and deliver effect. So I started to mention some of the successes. Sustainable support are looking at bringing out their own support strategy. That is in the process of clearance and should be made public soon. Through the Defence Supplier Forum, we have worked to educate ourselves and educate our suppliers. We've built shared methodologies. We've consulted. We've collaborated. We've started to understand what our roles and responsibilities are between ourselves, and we've started to chat through how do we incentivize this. We've engaged with NATO. We've engaged with our allies and partners. We're building joint action plans to support activity. But fundamentally, we need to get our methodologies right. We need to have a standardized approach to all of this. And we should focus on those areas that are going to have a multiplying effect, like NATO. What is the next single fuels policy? Do we need an alternative energy policy from NATO? We need to help ask those questions and help seek the answers to them. And also, we've actually now had a first comprehensive look at our emissions. Like most things, that if you don't ask questions, you don't get an answer. It's the same with data. We've re-baselined and revalidated our footprint, and that's seen our emissions move from 700,000 tonnes as reported as estate emissions and around 2.4 million tonnes in terms of capability emissions. We've revalidated all of that to ensure that we've updated just where we are on our emissions footprint. So to drive where we need to go, we need to know where we have been and where we are at the current time. These are the 5 priorities that I'm working for. I mentioned that CDS wanted to see things normalized quickly. I am doing cross-cutting departmental work. I'm identifying and delivering the departmental contribution to NetZero. More about that in a bit. I'm developing cross-defense literacy and wider skills training, and that's across the whole force and should be open to the whole force. I'm building functional enablers and tool sets. We need to ensure that we're speaking the same language, we're using the same systems, we're reporting in the same way. I'm integrating climate risk and ownership, and that's at the organizational level. And I'm also responding to the security implications of climate change. I mentioned identifying the departmental contribution to NetZero. This is where we currently are on our current targets. the current target is we will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 30%. This is across our estate only by 2025. And within that, we have a direct emissions target of 10%. So the 30% could probably be delivered primarily from the greening of the grid. That 10% is an actual real target that we have to go away and deliver. And we're doing that with all other departments against our greening government commitments. These commitments have been around for a decade, if not longer, and they essentially drive central government work around emissions reductions, water consumption, and the rest. Emissions, people might know about Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions. I mentioned we had revalidated our footprint. What we do in defence, and we borrowed this from the NHS, is we report on what we can directly influence. What we can directly influence is across Scopes 1, Scopes 2, and some of Scope 3. For instance, we can basically do installation in our service families accommodation. We can think and direct and influence employee commuting. We can influence the amount of waste we produce. So we've got a reporting a baseline boundary that is now that white box on the left-hand side. That is around 3.34 million tonnes. You may have heard that defence is 50% of central government emissions. That is for the estate only. If we include in our other capabilities, we are much, much more than that 50% target across central government's emissions. But it all depends on how we report and how DEFRA and BEIS, who control this reporting, actually state our emissions and report our emissions. Public sector emissions, as stated in the NetZero strategy, are estate focused only. They do not include any operational fleet emissions. They do not include border force. They do not include our own capability emissions. Where do our emissions come from? Primarily, they just come from our capabilities, and within that, most of those come actually from our fast jet force. We do have around 30% of it coming from our built estate, 15% of it coming from business travel, commuting, wastewater, but most of it is from our capabilities. Most of the built estate consumption, because the Army has a large estate, by the way, that's mostly the Army, and quite a lot of the capability energy. And I said, most of it is fast jet. The Navy are there as well in terms of the maritime fleet, but most of that is the Royal Air Force's emissions. This starts to show some of those differences. What you can see on the left-hand side there is the capability energy emissions from 1920 that come from aviation platforms. You can see the maritime there, and you can see the built estate energy, splitting it down. And on the right-hand side, if we followed the UK NetZero sectoral approach and the emission roadmaps within there, you will see that capability energy based on our emissions will make up the bulk of our emissions in 2050. And this talks about how difficult it is to essentially decarbonize certain sectors, and they're pretty much transport sectors, but it's aviation, commercial aviation, which is the real difficulty. And I've just put it there to illustrate just how important it is for some of the innovation work that the Royal Air Force are doing around synthetic fuels, and the work that's being done through the Jet Zero Council to send a signal to manufacturers of sustainable aviation fuel to bring these emissions down. But there's more work just going on than just carbon, working on climate risk methodologies based on the NEO taxonomy. I'm building how we need to adapt our capabilities and our estate to the impact of climate change. I'm also looking at our wider estate. We own 1% of the UK. So it's around 220,000 hectares of land. What are we going to do with that? How are we going to reform how we use our land? Can we increase its sequestration? Can we basically monetize nature? Can we make this an income stream that we can draw upon and actually take it into the defence budget, again, to either pay for some of the decarbonisation work or help sustain the defence budget going forward in terms of energy costs? I'm doing an educational training needs analysis across the whole force to make sure that we can upskill. So from phase 1 training all the way through to board training. There's little point to TLBs, frontline commands, enabling organisations doing their own training. 70% of the training should be the same, with 30% made relevant to the organisation. And of course, I'm trying to link processes all across defence. So for instance, I'm trying to link the STL through innovation to data to talk about more than lethality, but to talk about sustainability and self-sustainment in operations. And there's much, much more going on. And finally, I'd just like to come back to climate change and climate security. I mentioned it's the indirect and direct impacts of climate change on the security environment. I mentioned the fact that it's a wraparound around food, energy, human security. But this is very much an area that everybody is actually trying to get their heads around about. How do we understand what this does to the threat? How do we understand how we need to adjust and adapt to the threat? The Canadians at the moment have announced that they're going to try to establish a centre of excellence on climate and security. They're looking at doing work on the run up to the Vilnius summit next year. There's an awful lot of work going on around climate security, but it's not the securitization of climate change. It's making sure that we as armed forces know how we need to adapt, and we need to work alongside diplomacy and the development areas to make sure that wherever possible, that there has been an intervention before we're called upon to act. And I think, Greg, I will probably leave it there, if that's okay, and just take questions.
Yeah, excellent, James. Thank you. That's a real detailed canter across what is quite a conundrum. I can appreciate, but you're glad you've got a few staff with you now, and it's not just you worrying about the room. And this, I was quite struck there by some of the targets that you're already meeting. So it's clearly progress, and I think that's the big thing, isn't it? This is real now. This is not theory or things we talk about in an idle moment. This is beginning to feel like it's going to genuinely make a difference.
So there is something that industry still have to put pressure on defence. But it's not pressure in terms of tell us what your approach is going to be. It's that collaboration again of working through stuff so we can actually have the right metrics in place and the right approach. There will need to be investment in all of this, whether it's pump priming or sustained investment. That's a question for a strategic balance investment thing. But some of it is just understanding the fact that this does have long-term benefits. Right, before we started, I'm going to mention your solar panels, but our energy bills, I think we are one of the largest consumers of energy in the UK. Our energy bills are large, they are growing, and they will grow across a 10-year period. What are we doing to mitigate them? How can we actually make our estate more resilient itself? What does that do? Because, some of the stories that I've heard about the US, I think they got some of their US commanders engaged with this in terms of almost self-sufficiency by turning off the energy supply at the front gates of their establishment and asking them to generate the force. And all of a sudden you have people then talking about energy and talking about self-sufficiency and talking about what they would do if that actually happened. We need to be thinking about this. We need to have the right narratives, and we need to be pushing the agenda. Because it's not just about green. There is value here, and I haven't even talked about wider sustainability. There's an awful lot of stuff around wider sustainability that we need to get right, and the only way to get that right is actually through collaboration and conversation.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And for those that don't know, me and James were talking before we came on this evening, and I have just had my solar panels fitted. They turned on a week ago, and I have now become a very sad tosser in my house because I insist on everything being done when the sun's up, and after that, no one's allowed to turn anything on. But I enjoy sticking two fingers up to the electrics company, and I think with the situation in Russia and everywhere else that's going on, I just sense now there's a genuine shift in mindset, which can only be a good thing. And James, it's been fascinating. As I said, it's not our classical air power structures or space powered thing, but actually it is absolutely part of air and space power. It can't ignore it, and is fundamental to where we go moving forward. Andy Spinks has asked whether some of the slides can be made available. I know, James, we talked about that. We're going to check with James to see what can be released, because there's obviously a lot of detail in there that may or may not be sensitive. So we'll see what we can release, and if we can put this out on the normal channels, we'll absolutely do that if we can. But James, I think we'd love to have you back, because things are going to move fast, and if we don't act, then things aren't going to go in the right direction. So we do need to keep an eye on this. So let's set a date for another opportunity to see where we've got to and see what needs to be done to keep moving us forward. So thank you on behalf of everybody for taking the time, but more importantly for doing what you do, because that's a pretty large portfolio. And as an ex-fast jet pilot, I can only apologise. I'm planting trees as fast as possible. I may die before I get there.
Cool. Thank you, everyone. Cheers. Have a good evening.
Thanks, James. And thanks, Robbie and Clive, for sending up. Cheers all. Thanks a lot.